Greetings, traveller through time. Tonight we go back to 1484, near a small village under Castile's rule. Night falls over wattle and daub houses thatched with straw, filling the air with the scent of hearth smoke mingled with dew rising from the damp earth, a perfume of burned wood and moisture, the hallmark of a life both simple and perilous. Flickering tallow lanterns cast long, ghostly shadows that make it seem as if the trees at the forest's edge shift and watch whatever unfolds in the village's quiet. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. Feel the scratch of coarse wool against your skin, the only real shield from the icy breeze that slips down from the mountains, carrying the distant echo of a church bell tolling curfew. It's a slow, deep sound that does more than mark the hour. It draws the boundary between day and darkness, between watch and uneasy rest. And for many, it also warns of patrols, tax collectors, or something far worse. Now, take a deep breath and notice the subtle, pressing weight of medieval air. It's more than air. It's a dense mix of profound piety and quiet terror. The line between natural and supernatural is as thin as a barber's razor. A failed harvest or sudden illness isn't taken as chance or nature's whim, but as a direct sign of blessing, or more often, a curse. Fear seasons every meal, hums beneath every whispered prayer, and hides behind every small gesture meant to fend off the evil eye. You can almost hear muffled voices inside the houses, the steady, hypnotic rhythm of a loom still working late, and a lone dog barking out in the fields, the soundtrack of survival. These small noises try to drown out the great silence of the night, a silence that, paradoxically, feels more dangerous than the clamor of day. Here, darkness isn't just the absence of light, it's a palpable presence, swollen with untold stories and unspoken fears. And into that secret-laden dark we'll step, slowly, holding our breath, like someone careful not to wake a sleeping giant, to witness one of the era's most ruthless engines of power. We stand at the threshold of 1484, when the Inquisition of Castile and Aragon had already sunk deep roots, more an arm of royal power than a purely ecclesiastical authority. Historically, its chief concern wasn't witchcraft, but heresy, any deviation from orthodox Catholic faith. Witchcraft, at least at this early stage, was more often handled by local secular courts and would intensify only in the century to come. Even so, an accusation of witchcraft was a devastating tool, often used to settle land disputes, fuel personal revenge, or silence any voice that challenged the established order or village custom. A mere suspicion could wreck a lifetime of labor and reputation, turning a community against one of its own, with fury stoked by panic and religious indoctrination. The village air hangs heavy with the lingering smell of incense from morning mass, mixed with the rougher scents of manure and wet hay, proof of how closely the sacred and the profane live side by side between what's prayed and what's lived on the hard ground of daily subsistence. It's on this stage of contrasts that we meet our central figure, a woman named Alex. Her plain, common name belies the extraordinary, terrible situation she's caught in. She's neither noble nor a known heretic, just a peasant whose life turns with the seasons, who tends goats and spins coarse wool. Invisible work, yet vital to the economy of her small rural world. In her 30-odd years with calloused hands, her only wealth amounts to a few tools and the memory of a husband taken by fever. A loss that leaves her doubly exposed in a society that sees an unaccompanied woman as an easy target for suspicion and envy. Her cottage, now sealed with the mark of the Holy Office, is a small refuge of stone and clay on the village's edge, ringed by a modest plot where she grows garlic and a few common medicinal herbs. In those witch-hunting times, such knowledge could flip overnight from folk wisdom to proof of a pact with evil, All it took was a jealous neighbor or a spurned man to slip an anonymous denunciation to passing inquisitors. Popular belief and official doctrine often blended in condemnation. Simply knowing the strength of a chamomile infusion or assisting at a difficult birth, no matter how innocent, could mark someone as the devil's servant, especially a woman, so often imagined as the doorway to original sin. Like many peasant women, Alix keeps a worn rosary in her pocket, attends Sunday Mass, though she barely grasps the liturgy, and fears God and Judgment Day as deeply as she fears winter hunger and sickness. Her faith is simple and practical, more ritual and hope for protection than deep theology. Yet her fate is sealed not by faith or lack of it, but by a neighbor's envy for her slightly better soil and by the death of a child who didn't survive the harsh winter. Alas, the father, blinded by grief, pins on a malign intervention rather than on life's fragility. The accusing finger points to Alix not because of what she did, but because fear and collective imagination desperately need a culprit. A common tragedy becomes a diabolic crime, and the ever-lurking evil suddenly wears a face. The rumor starts as a dry whisper from the resentful neighbor, then grows at night around the fire as fear feeds it, until it reaches the ears of itinerant inquisitors. A traveling court moving from town to town, spreading both God's word and the terror of authority. For these black-robed men, trained to accuse and investigate heresy, a single charge, without solid evidence or reliable witnesses, is enough to launch formal proceedings. Their aim isn't to prove innocence, but to wrench out a confession, the sole doorway, as they see it, to the sinner's salvation. They arrive one grey morning on bony horses. Their presence drops a hush over the village, a silence louder than any shout. At the sight of their banners and their aides cold, indifferent eyes, blood runs cold, doors slam, shutters latch, as if the evil they hunt might spread by touch. Alix is taken under cover of night, an arrest staged with shadows and silence, so the terror cuts deeper. The heavy boots thudding on her packed earth floor are the last sounds of freedom she hears for a long time. She's pulled from her garden, her few belongings, her plain life, and hauled to the dungeon of a nearby town, the tribunal's temporary seat, a dark, damp place where mold and despair cling so thickly they seem baked into the stone. Sunlight survives there only as a faint memory. For all its written rules and fussy bureaucracy, the Inquisition works on a simple premise. The accused is guilty until proven otherwise. Torture, though not a punishment, is considered a legitimate, even necessary way to purify the soul and lead it to the truth of confession. Physical coercion dressed up as spiritual care, a grim inversion of Christian values that lays bare the era's mindset. In her cell, the walls sweat with cold. Water drips from somewhere above, slow, relentless, maddening. Time stretches thin and endless. Alone and helpless, Alix feels her identity dissolving. She's no longer a peasant, a spinner, a widow. She's the accused, a potential heretic, a body to be purified under the gaze of God and his earthly agents. Her humanity is stripped away. She becomes an object of theological and legal scrutiny, a small piece on the vast, terrible board of forced salvation. Her mind, shaped by work and prayer, starts to whirl with confusion and panic. What could they possibly want her to confess? Her life is so plain, so free of grand events or notorious sins, she can't imagine the evil they're pinning on her. Not even knowing the charge is a terror worse than the accusation itself. You can't deny what you don't fully know or understand. The inquisitors, led by Father Fray Tomas, a pale-faced man with cold eyes, schooled in canon law and utterly convinced of his divine mission, aren't interested in the truth of facts, only the truth of faith. To them, refusal to confess is itself proof of demonic meddling, the devil hardening a sinner's heart against repentance. It's a brutal circle of logic that guarantees guilt before evidence. Simply standing before the tribunal signals sin and the need for forced purification. The trial becomes an act of coercive faith and social cleansing. At the first formal interrogation, Alex, paralyzed by fear, is grilled for details about her prayers, her neighbors, her church-going, and her knowledge of herbs. Each answer, no matter how innocent, is set down by the scribe's goose quill, scratching rhythmically across rough parchment, a dry, steady sound that seems to write her fate with mechanical, merciless coolness. The notes aren't taken to find truth, but to catch contradictions and half-truths that can be used later as proof of lies and allegiance to evil. Her innocence isn't a possibility to weigh, it's a deception to expose under the bright light of faith and law. Her thin, trembling voice is easily smothered by the tribunal's unquestioned authority. The psychological pressure is instant and crushing. Without raising his voice, the Inquisitor speaks with absolute conviction of salvation, of the eternal fire of hell, and of the Church's mercy that can be reached only through total confession. Your body may be punished, he says, but your soul will be saved. For a woman whose deepest worry is her eternal fate, it's a terrible temptation and a cruel paradox. The Inquisition plays on the most rooted fears of her faith and culture, using the promise of redemption as its sharpest weapon. Alex's silence is read not as confusion or innocence, but as stubborn, diabolic resistance. In the days that follow, her quiet suffering is paced by the drip in her cell and brief visits from aides who carry veiled threats. They show her the instruments of torture without touching them, letting their dark, heavy presence hang in the air. The mere sight of worn leather straps and rusted irons is enough to break many spirits. Anticipated pain, the threat itself, proves more effective than the pain it promises. The goal isn't punishment, it's confession, the keystone that validates the system and its authority. Alex's fear turns into exhaustion, then mental fog, blurring the line between what she's done and what they insist she's done. Sometimes the scribe reads aloud confessions already taken from other prisoners, vivid tales of satanic rites, night flights, and blood pacts. His dry, steady voice sketches horrors Alex's simple mind can hardly conceive. The words work like a bleak hypnosis, planting the seeds of what she must say to make the terror stop. The witchcraft script, foreign to her life, becomes the only script that offers a way out. A forced confession is the single door to the outside. And even if that door opens onto a pyre, the alternative feels worse. One sleepless night, hope leaves her body like heat from stone. She prays, but her words seem to ricochet off the thick walls. God's silence feels like the harshest judgment. Starved, sleep-broken and afraid, her body starts to give way. Pain and fear are her only companions now. A mind once steady and fixed on the soil begins to conjure strange images, mixing reality with exhaustion-born nightmares. Here's the turning point: pure, simple innocence eroded by the need to survive and the cruel promise of an end to suffering. Confession looks like a path, refusal, a bottomless pit. Her resistance, once held together by the plain truth of her life, unravels like wet wool. She starts to think that maybe, if she says what they want, repeats the witchcraft tales the scribe read, names a demon, names a Sabbath, she might finally rest. The hunger for peace and silence outweighs justice and truth. In this system, the most basic human desire, the end of fear and pain, is weaponized to manufacture guilt. Innocence becomes a luxury she can't afford, a weight she no longer has the strength to carry. Shivering, she longs only for the end of questioning and the feel of sunlight, even if it's the final light of the flames waiting for her. And so, with a clouded mind and a body near collapse, Alex begins to weave a false confession, stitching together fragments of stories she's heard and suggestions fed by her interrogators. A tapestry of lies spun under threat and coercion, yet to the court, an ironclad proof of guilt. Her words don't come from conviction, but from raw, simple desperation, a short-term bid to survive, even if it means doom later. The sound of her weak, hesitant voice, describing acts her plain soul could never have conceived, becomes the system's victory song. Coercion, menace, and terror have remade truth and conjured guilt from nothing, neatly justifying their own cruelty. And the scribe's quill keeps scraping, turning the inventions of torture into legal and historical fact, a cold, impersonal record of her suffering. Alex's confession unfolded in the heavy hush of the audience hall. Only the occasional crackle of wall torches and the scribe's quill scratching across parchment seemed alive. Father Fray Tomas watched her with a look that blended forced pity and professional satisfaction. To him, every lie she uttered under duress wasn't falsehood at all, but a recognition of the spiritual truth the church sought to extract. His manner never shifted, cool, unruffled, even when the peasant woman, desperate to please him and hasten the end of her suffering, described meetings with the devil lifted straight from church sermons and the woodcuts handed out in villages. Her confession, in other words, was a script pre-written by the very doctrine that condemned her, a grim theatre piece of beliefs she barely understood. The terror of the torture chamber, she had been shown it but not yet harmed, was more devastating than pain itself. It seeped into her pores and kept her from thinking clearly or defending herself. In a voice that hardly sounded like her own, Alex began inventing details about supposed potions and spells, naming poisonous herbs she'd never dared to gather, and rituals she knew only as whispers from fairy tales and old wives' stories. She twisted simple home remedies and folk cures into acts of malefice, turning neighborly help into harm so the Inquisitor's narrative would hold together and fit the theological frame of witch persecution. The confession became a joint construction, a terrible collaboration between a victim's fear and her judge's absolute conviction. She admitted to drying the cow's milk, cursing the wind so it would ruin the richer neighbor's harvest, and meeting the evil one in the shape of a black goat on moonless nights in a place she vaguely called the darkest clearing in the forest. The Inquisitor and scribe recorded each flourish with sober diligence, for every detail, no matter how fanciful, shored up the legitimacy of their mission and the devil's very real work on earth. When Alex realized that the more she invented, the faster the questioning seemed to move toward its end, a cold resignation settled in her chest. She knew her words condemned her, but the need to escape confinement and threat pressed harder than any fight for life or honor. The record of her lie was the only ticket to even a moment's peace. This inquisitorial process, of which Alex was now the sacrificial victim, rested on a telling habit of ecclesiastical record-keeping. Confession sat at the center. It was prized so highly that the tribunal captured every word with exacting care, trying to fashion a near-scientific corpus of proof for the crimes of heresy and witchcraft. Costly parchment and permanent ink turned the fragility of forced speech into legal and historical document. In this sense, the scribe's role outweighed even the judge's in terms of memory and permanence. His quill transformed fear's delirium into ironclad fact for centuries to come. The scratch of that quill, writing down Alex's confession, was the sound of history being falsified and her true identity erased, crushed beneath the tribunal's narrative and the weight of fear. Exhausted and starving, Alex felt the faint heat of a brazier in the corner. No comfort, only sweat born of anxiety. The air was thick with sweat, damp cell, new parchment and wet ink, an oppressive odor that defined the courtroom's atmosphere. She tried and failed to remember the smell of cut hay or fresh bread from her village. Terror had wiped those scents clean. The reality of her simple life felt as distant and unreal as the Sabbaths and pacts with the devil she was now describing. Her body, once sturdy from fieldwork, shook and weakened, subdued not by evidence but by exhaustion and relentless psychological pressure. At one point, the Inquisitor asked about her night flight, a classic element in witchcraft tales. Alex, unsure how to answer, mumbled something about being carried through the air by an unseen force. Too vague, the Inquisitor warned, his voice a shade louder, that lying was a sin and refusing detail would be taken as a sign the devil was blocking her full confession. The threat made her tremble and pushed her to add that she had, in fact, anointed her body with a strange salve that stank, she improvised, of herbs and rancid goat fat. The sensory disgust of that image was instantly accepted as authentic proof of a witch's rite, and the scribe's scratching quickened, fixing the fantasy as irrefutable fact. When her confession, now swollen with invented details, was finished, the scribe read it aloud, a vivid, terrifying catalogue of sins she'd never committed. It sounded like someone else's story, yet it was handed back to her as her own life. The Inquisitor asked whether she affirmed it as truth, as the confession of her soul. With a knot in her throat and silent tears in her eyes, Alex only nodded. She couldn't form a single word of denial or defense. Her body was spent, and the confession, false as it was, meant the questioning would stop, and she'd return to the relative quiet of her cell, away from the judge's oppressive presence and his aides. The relief was brief and bitter, acceptance of her own condemnation. What followed for Alex shows how the inquisitorial system turned coercion into law. Once extracted, confession became the unshakable foundation of conviction. The legal process ceased to be a search for justice and shrank into a formality, a way to stamp a guilt already established by words forced under threat. The forced confession was the cornerstone of the Inquisition's legal theological edifice, a stark historical fact that exposes the system's terror. A victim's words weaponized against her, recorded forever as proof of the devil's work. Back in Alex's village, news of her confession would bring both relief and dread. Their fear felt validated, their denunciation confirmed. After her formal sentence, based entirely on her own coerced words, Alex was returned to prison to await its execution. In the cell's silence, the drip of water became her countdown, slow and inexorable. With her mind a little calmer, she recalled the smell of her garden soil after rain and the rasp of wool between her fingers, images of a simple, honest life she'd been forced to deny. The peace she'd hoped confession might bring never arrived. In its place came a cold emptiness and deep remorse. She'd lied about her soul to save her body, and now, by the doctrine she'd been compelled to accept, her body would burn and her soul was lost. The irony of her fate was as cruel as the system that crushed her. In Alex's small village, the execution would bring a fleeting sense of relief, as if evil had been cut out at the root. History's footnotes tell us that the condemned's goods were often confiscated by the tribunal or the crown. In Alex's case, her modest plot would be up for grabs, neighbors free to contest it, envy and greed driving many accusations of witchcraft and heresy far more than piety ever did. Her name would vanish from conversation, but her story of fear and forced confession would hang in the village air like a warning, a quiet, chilling lesson about the danger of crossing, even unknowingly, the fixed order of custom and the unbending authority of the church. The chill of Alex's cell, where the smell of mold and saltpeter from wet stone mixed with the sour odor of dirty straw, stood in painful contrast to the image of the Inquisitor, Fray Thomas, now resting in his warmed chamber, reviewing documents sealed with hard red wax. They were the physical, bureaucratic proof of a confession he saw as faith's victory over the devil's cunning. That distance between suffering and the administration of suffering is one of the era's hardest truths, an abyss of perception where the prisoner's terror became the judge's cold satisfaction. Unlike the popular image of a sadistic torturer, Fray Tomás was methodical and deeply convinced of the justice of his cause, an intellectual who viewed the Inquisition not as punishment, but as an instrument of social and theological purification. He regarded Alix's confession, forced though it was, as the first step towards saving her soul, even if her body was irretrievably bound for the stake. It's a small but crucial historical truth about inquisitors of the time. They saw themselves as saviors, not executioners. For Alix, darkness in the cell was more than the absence of light. It was a thick veil separating her from the reality of her former life. The only sounds left to her were her heart beating slow and uneven, and the drip of water that had become her private metronome, measuring the unbearable crawl of the time she had left. In that oppressive quiet, she tried, in vain, to feel sunlight on her skin, a comfort that now seemed a forgotten luxury, a vague memory from a world that no longer belonged to her. Her life had been stolen and replaced with a witch's script she'd been forced to accept. Her touch, now acquainted only with clammy stone and damp cold, ached for the feel of wool's soft scratch or warm, dry earth beneath bare feet. All that remained was the hard, unyielding truth of stone. At the center of this desperate scene stood not Alix herself, but the small, single object left to her after the confession. A tiny crucifix of dark, worn wood, almost shapeless from use, which she'd managed to hide beneath the knot of her shift before she was taken. Simple and fragile, it was her last physical link to faith and identity, a small symbol of hope and contradiction. Ironically, the very faith that anchored her had made her vulnerable to the Inquisition's manipulation, which used the promise of salvation to force confession. The smooth wood, polished by years and the sweat of her palms, was the only comfort she found in the dark, a place to rest her mind in a world dissolved into lies and fear. The tiny crucifix, no longer than her thumb, carried the lingering scent of the village church's cheap incense, a faint fragrance that remained her olfactory memory of the outside world. The smell of community, of mass, of forgiveness, and of the simple faith she'd practiced with devotion. It clashed sharply with the stink of mold, urine, and fear soaked into the walls and straw of the cell. Alix pressed the wood into her palm, drawing in its scent and feel in a desperate attempt to reconnect with a reality where her guilt was only invention and her God was merciful and just, not the stern and unforgiving judge presented by the tribunal. That small piece of wood became her last object of devotion and resistance. In the darkness, she tried to steady her gaze on its indistinct shape, the only thing left to contemplate. This quiet act of contemplation, simple as it was, became her final act of inner freedom, a silent defiance against the system that had stripped her of everything except the choice of where to place her faith and attention. As she did, she felt a faint, fleeting warmth seem to radiate from the little object, imagined perhaps, but real enough to her, standing against the cell's icy stone. That warmth was the one proof of her remaining humanity and faith. Her breath, once shallow and erratic, slowed and deepened, taking on the rhythm of a wordless, desperate prayer. Meanwhile, as Fray Tomás reviewed Alix's confession, he noted the lack of complex theological detail and concluded she was a rustic, ignorant witch, easy prey for the evil one, with weak faith and limited knowledge. However misguided, that conclusion strengthened his belief that he was dealing with a simple soul in need of purifying fire to be saved. He saw his work as divine mercy and social cleansing, a quiet mystery of fanaticism and self-assurance where cruelty is justified by faith. Despite his cool demeanor, He truly believed he was carrying out God's will, a conviction that made him all the more terrible and complex in the medieval setting. His pen scratched out the final lines of the sentence, a document that sealed Alex's fate with bureaucratic formality and a chilling calm. In her cell, Alex remembered the taste of fresh bread and clean well water, memories that brought a small stab of pain and longing. The absence of those simple flavors had become her sharpest suffering, silent, private, and layered atop the terror of condemnation. She tried, without success, to taste the salt of her own sweat, a bitter flavor of defeat and resignation. The sense of loss and despair was so strong it kept her from eating the daily ration of hard bread and dirty water, and that only deepened her physical and mental weakness. The heavy wooden door opening and closing at mealtimes was the one sound that broke the hush, dry, final, marking time and her nearness to the end. The ceaseless drip took on new meaning. It no longer simply marked time. It became the sound of her soul weeping in silence, the liquid rhythmic shape of her sorrow and fear. She tried to count the drops to keep her mind focused, to hold back the whirlwind of thoughts and terrors that battered her. But the sound was too monotonous, too hypnotic. Her mind slipped, and she drifted into a dull half-consciousness where reality blended with nightmares born of exhaustion and hunger. The small crucifix, clenched in her hand, was the one thing anchoring her to the real, the one point of truth in a world of forced lies and institutionalized terror. In this century, the Inquisition's terror was magnified by secrecy. Proceedings were held behind closed doors. The accused didn't know who accused them or what evidence was brought, making any defense impossible. Forced confession became the sole proof of cooperation with the Church, a historical fact that lays bare the system's cruelty. Justice, such as it was, could be bought by the rich and powerful. In her poverty and simplicity, Alex was the perfect target for the Church's and Crown's display of power. Her suffering would be little more than a paragraph in the grand annals of the Inquisition, but for her it was the entire world, the only reality she had. Even so, her faith wasn't completely broken. The little crucifix proved her quiet resistance, a token of her belief in a God different from the one the Inquisition proclaimed, a God of mercy and forgiveness, not a God of fire and doom. She prayed in silence, no words, only the heart, asking for the strength to face what was coming. The feel of cold wood in her palm was her only answer, a tactile, wordless reply that gave her inner steadiness, a quiet, unexpected calm in the middle of despair. The slow, deep tide of her breathing was her single prayer, her last act of devotion and silent resistance against the system that had condemned her. That image of Alex in the cell, clutching the tiny crucifix, turns her suffering into a small human story of silent endurance, an intimate act of devotion that defies the tribunal and the confession wrung from her. It's a picture of deep stillness in the midst of terror, a proof that faith and humanity couldn't be wholly rooted out by threat or coercion. Her body, weakened and hungry, was now only the shell of a soul that refused to break, a soul that found comfort in the touch of a simple wooden object. The slow, steady drip became the sound of her meditation, the rhythm of her heart, a lullaby in the dark. The serenity Alex found in this final act of devotion stood in subtle contrast to the terror that consumed her during questioning. A quiet that arrived with acceptance of the inevitable, a cool peace that follows the peak of fear. She no longer feared the flames. The stake meant the end of suffering and a return to peace, the true peace denied by the tribunal and the confession they forced upon her. Her focus narrowed to the present, the feel of wood, the sound of water, the cell's darkness. Her mind, once stormy and scattered, grew clear and still, ready for her fate, an unexpected calm that was her last and only victory. As Fray Thomas finished his review, he felt relieved to have done his duty. He sincerely believed Alex's confession proved her cooperation with the church. Ironically, a point that, in his view, earned her a lighter spiritual sentence. But his satisfaction was cold and bureaucratic, stripped of real feeling. A quiet riddle of fanaticism where cruelty becomes routine. His thoughts had already moved on to the next case, the next heretic to be purified. Alex's fate was now just an entry in his ledger, a number in the tally of souls saved through punishment. The final scratch of his pen, noting the date of execution, was the impersonal closing note of medieval justice, a justice built on forced confession and coercion. In the end, the image of the small crucifix, worn smooth with use, tight in Alex's hand, in the cell's darkness, stands as a symbol of silent resistance and unshaken faith. It's a tactile, fragrant link to the world stolen from her. Her slow, steady breath is the last sound that remains, a quiet serenity set against the terror of a coerced confession. And her soul, despite the lie wrung from her, finds its final peace in the certainty of her faith and the acceptance of her fate. The air in Alex's cell carried a faint, bittersweet scent of pine resin, seeping slowly from the beams above. A natural fragrance that, to her, recalled the open forest and the free wind sweeping across her face during long days spent tending goats. That memory of wind, so vivid once, now felt like a dream, distant and unreachable. The tiny crucifix pressed to her chest held the same chill as the old wood itself, its surface absorbing and reflecting the cell's stone-cold air. It had become a silent, motionless companion in her forced solitude, a simple object now filled with meaning because it was all that remained of her honest life. While Alex sank into her enforced stillness, Fray Thomas dictated a detailed letter to his scribe, Master Laurent, addressed to the tribunal's headquarters in Seville. In it, he described the success of his mission to purify that corner of Castile, including Alex's case as an example of full repentance, a gesture of self-promotion disguised as piety. The Inquisition, after all, had to prove its efficiency and its ongoing necessity to royal and ecclesiastical authorities. This bureaucratic self-justification was a quiet truth of the 15th century Holy Office. Its power and legitimacy were measured not by mercy, but by the number of cases and confessions it collected. The steady rasp of Master Laurent's quill across parchment echoed through the nearly empty chamber, a dry, rhythmic sound that, to Fray Thomas, meant order restored and heresy subdued. It was a harsh contrast to the faint, even breathing of Alex below in her cell. He dictated with legal precision, describing her pact with the devil and night flight as irrefutable facts, transforming her forced lies into official truth, a terrible inversion that formed the core of the system. The Inquisitor felt the soft warmth of the fireplace on his hands as he wrote about the peasant woman's fiery fate, his physical comfort mirroring the cold detachment of his conviction. In the cell, the slow, constant drip of water had taken on a melancholy rhythm that soothed Alex's exhausted mind, a dull peace where past and future merged into the slow present of confinement. She tried to remember the sound of children playing in the village, that joyous, chaotic noise of life that once filled her days. Its absence was a void replaced only by her own breath and heartbeat, the intimate sounds of life that remained within her, standing in stark contrast to the institutional silence of a place where her voice had been erased and replaced by the tribunal's authority. Her first terror had softened into a quiet mystery of acceptance, a calm surrender to the inevitable. She no longer fought the stone walls or wept for her stolen innocence. Instead, she found a strange inner stillness, a resignation that became her last form of resistance. Her body could be punished, but her soul, she believed, rested safely in the hands of a God far more merciful than the one preached by her inquisitor. That silent faith was her anchor, her hidden refuge in the dark. The feel of the crucifix was her proof of belief, a simple object turned symbol of hope and contradiction amid despair. In her drifting thoughts, Alex remembered a village custom. At day's end, women would sing soft, repetitive songs to chase away evil spirits of the night, simple, hypnotic melodies that lulled everyone to safe, peaceful sleep. She tried to recall one of those tunes, but fear and exhaustion had sealed her memory. The only lullaby left was the dripping water, the slow, steady rhythm that became her final cradle song, a sound of farewell and acceptance, carrying her gently toward the one escape still allowed to her: sleep. Upstairs, after sealing his letter, Fray Tomas gazed through the barred window at the cold, distant stars. Their stillness reminded him of mankind's smallness and sinfulness. He saw himself as a beacon of light in the world's darkness, a defender of order and faith. That serene contemplation of the heavens was his own act of devotion, a terrible contrast to Alex's forced contemplation of the crucifix in her cell, where she saw nothing but her hands and felt only the cold stone. That difference in perspective between judge and condemned was the essence of medieval tragedy. Alex, utterly spent, finally drifted into deep, dreamless sleep, a temporary refuge from fear and pain. The tiny crucifix slipped from her fingers, but remained close, nestled beneath her collar, her last link to the world beyond. The slow, steady drip of water kept vigil by her side, the only sound marking time's quiet erosion. Its calm, unyielding rhythm guided her gently toward her final fate, and her slow, even breathing was proof of a fleeting peace, her small, fragile victory over the cruelty of the system. Alex's small crucifix, a detail so insignificant amid the stones and shadows, radiated a silence that spoke louder to her than all the words of accusation and confession combined. At dawn, when a faint grey light seeped through the cracks high in the wall, the dark wood seemed to draw in what little brightness there was, standing out against her pale skin. She noticed the top of the crucifix, where the carving of Christ's head had nearly vanished under the wear and sweat of generations, a sign of its age and the deep devotion it carried within her family, a piece of spiritual inheritance. That small object, now her only comfort, was the tangible proof that her faith was simple and steadfast, not the heresy they claimed it to be. As she slowly awoke, Alex tried to focus her gaze on the rough texture of the stone around her, feeling the cold seep from the walls into her bones, a cold that had become her constant companion, a symbol of the tribunal's institutional chill. The smell of mold and dampness grew heavier as morning advanced, thick and suffocating, choking her breath and contrasting painfully with the remembered scent of hay and wet earth from her garden. Her body's rhythm had slowed, now matching the steady drip that measured time in her cell, a monotone lullaby that cradled her in a painful stillness. She gripped the crucifix with near-desperate strength, as if her life depended on that small piece of wood, a simple object that had become the center of her universe, the heart of her quiet contemplation. Meanwhile, in his heated chamber, Fray Tomas studied the decrees of the Council of Vienne, an old church document he used to reinforce his theological arguments about the dangerous infiltration of magic among the common people. He viewed Alex's confession as yet another piece of evidence proving the need for constant vigilance, a detail that reveals much about the mindset of the time. In his logic, Alex's poverty and lack of formal education were not signs of innocence, but the very soil in which the devil's seeds of deviation could grow most easily, making her, in his reasoning, a particularly important soul to purify. His intellectual rigor, stripped of empathy, was the engine of his justified cruelty, a chilling contrast between his learned precision and the crushed simplicity of the peasant woman. The scent of new parchment and fresh ink in Fray Tomas's chamber, the fragrance of scholarship and authority, was the olfactory opposite of the damp despair filling Alex's cell. The dry scratching of Master Laurent's quill across parchment was the rhythm of bureaucratic terror, turning suffering into legal document and forced lies into historical truth. In her cell, Alex's body grew weaker, her breathing shallow and uneven, a physical sign of surrender to the inevitable. Her only comfort was the cold, familiar touch of the crucifix, grounding her in a sense of belonging to a world that had betrayed her, yet that she still loved in its humble simplicity. That small wooden cross became, for Alex, a focus of silent resistance, a tactile anchor in a sea of lies and coercion. She tried in vain to recall her late husband's voice, but that memory had been buried under the dripping water and the crushing quiet of the cell. So she focused instead on the feel of the wood, its worn, polished surface, and that act of still contemplation became her prayer, her final defense against the machinery of the Inquisition. The small piece of wood in Alex's hand, a crucifix barely distinguishable in the cell's dim light, carried a faint scent of earth and dew, the very essence of the life that had been stolen from her. She lifted it closer to her face, trying to breathe in that memory, to replace the nauseating metallic odor of fear that clung to the prison air. In her mind, she imagined the morning sun warming the wood, a fragile recollection of heat that stood in sharp contrast to the bone-deep cold surrounding her. The chill of the cell seemed eternally trapped on the edge of freezing, seeping into her marrow, turning her despair to stone. That act of sensory imagination became her last form of escape, her quiet rebellion of the mind against the oppressive world closing in around her. In the warmth of his chamber, Fray Tomas spoke with Master Laurent about the proper technique for recording testimonies, a detail that illustrates the Inquisition's bureaucratic precision, one of the earliest European institutions to systematize written procedure and archival record. They discussed the importance of using precise legal terminology to describe Alex's supposed acts of witchcraft, turning her vague, coerced inventions into clearly defined crimes against the faith. It was a chilling glimpse into how guilt was manufactured, how falsehood was formalized through meticulous documentation. The calm, authoritative voice of Fray Tomas, as he dictated Latin terms for the offenses, became the audible shape of power. The sound that had crushed the frail, truthful voice of the peasant woman, echoing her condemnation long before her death. Back in her cell, Alex's weary eyes traced the pattern of dark green moss spreading slowly through the cracks in the stone, a small, silent growth, the only living thing she could still observe in that place of death and confinement. That patch of damp, vivid color became a focus of meditation, a fragile point of beauty amid decay. Watching it grow, even imperceptibly, was her way of connecting to the outside world, to life still unfolding beyond her walls. The moss, cool and slimy to the touch, mirrored her own existence, life suffocating beneath the damp weight of the system that had judged her. The ceaseless dripping of water deepened her sense of isolation. Alex tried to give meaning to each drop, turning the monotonous sound into a rhythm that carried her into a trance-like calm. She remembered an old rural belief, a medieval superstition that slow, rhythmic dripping over earth could bless or curse, depending on one's intent. Now, she heard the dripping on the stone as her own curse, the sound of time draining away. Its slow, merciless beat led her toward the end, and her steady breathing became her only form of control, the single thread keeping her body and mind aligned in fragile serenity. Her contemplation of the crucifix grew deeper, a final, intimate study of the object that was her only possession. Her fingertips traced the three intersecting grooves at its center, where Christ's figure was almost invisible, worn away by generations of devotion. That fading image of suffering and redemption filled her with a soft, resigned calm. The dark wood, polished smooth from use, contrasted with the roughness of her skin. Hands once hardened by the soil, now cold from stillness and lack of blood. This quiet act, feeling the wood, studying her own trembling hand, became her last prayer, her silent farewell to the world. And in that acceptance, in that fragile moment of peace, she found her final victory over fear, a serenity deeper than resistance itself. The forced stillness of Alex's cell was broken at last by movement, a brief but jarring transition that would alter her senses and her fragile perception of the world. The dry, thunderous crack of the wooden door being flung open shattered the monotony of dripping water. The sudden noise jolted her awake, and her heart leapt violently in her chest, a physical shock that tore her from her meditative resignation. Then came light, faint but direct, flooding the cell like an attack. Her eyes, long adjusted to darkness, flinched from the intrusion, and she raised her arm to shield them, a reflexive gesture of defense against the brightness that heralded the arrival of the guards and the beginning of her final journey, her last step out of confinement's shadow. 2 guards entered, large men in stiff leather armor, smelling of sweat and cheap wine. Their sheer presence filled the small cell, pressing in on her with their mass and their detached professionalism. The sound of their heavy, rhythmic boots on the stone floor was a grim drumbeat announcing her fate. One of them grunted and grabbed her arm with a rough, impersonal grip, a violent touch that contrasted sharply with the soft, worn smoothness of her crucifix. That physical contact was her brutal re-entry into the world of power, force, and judgment that awaited her beyond the walls. The transition had begun, from the cold stone of the cell to the coarse earth of the courtyard. Dragged outside, Alex felt the sudden shift in air, a cutting, dry cold that differed from the damp chill of the dungeon. The change made her bones ache, her body trembling under the abrupt contrast in temperature. Her eyes, slow to adjust, blinked against the pale, diffused morning light, and for the first time in weeks she saw a fragment of sky. It was pale and cloudless, immense in its emptiness, a vision that struck her with both freedom and grief. That sky was the vastness of a world she was about to leave behind. The air she drew in tasted cleaner, carrying the scent of dew and soil, so fresh, so alive, that it pulled at her heart. It smelled of gardens, of labor, of her old life. The memory of that scent was a cruel comfort, a sensory bridge between life and the death waiting ahead. The courtyard into which she was led was uneven, its surface a mix of packed earth and loose stones, surrounded by high, cold walls of rough masonry that cast a permanent shadow. The guards' footsteps and the scrape of Alex's worn sandals echoed harshly between those walls, amplifying every sound into a grim rhythm. The coarse gravel beneath her bare feet scraped her skin, grounding her painfully in the present, an intimate, raw contact with the same earth she had once tended with love. This movement from darkness to light, from silence to echo, was more than physical. It was symbolic. The unseen, psychological threat of the cell now took visible form in the armed men and the machinery of authority that surrounded her. They halted before a thick wooden gate where a simple ox cart awaited. Its solid wooden wheels creaked loudly as it shifted, a deep rhythmic groan that to Alex sounded like the voice of her fate, ready to carry her toward its end. The oxen were thin, their large eyes resigned. The sight of them brought her a fleeting, piercing thought of kinship. She, too, was a beast of burden, driven by forces greater and more merciless than herself. The smell of hay and manure rising from the cart was oddly comforting, an aroma of the countryside, of ordinary life, familiar and human. It mingled painfully with the metallic scent of iron and fear. a sensory clash between the world of labor and the machinery of death. Fray Thomas and Master Laurent stood by the cart, cloaked in their formal dark robes. Their silent, composed presence radiated authority, giving the scene the air of a ritual rather than a punishment. Alix avoided the Inquisitor's gaze, yet she could feel it, cold, assessing, impersonal, a look that saw her not as a woman, but as a record in a book, a finished case. Their quiet voices murmured instructions to the guards, the professional tone of men discussing logistics rather than life and death. The thick-walled structure behind them loomed with narrow, barred windows, a reminder of medieval architecture's true purpose, not rehabilitation, but containment and display of power. The very weight of the stone was a symbol of law's inflexibility and the permanence of authority. When the guards lifted her onto the cart, the motion was awkward and painful. Her weak limbs obeyed clumsily, her joints stiff from weeks of confinement. She settled on the rough wooden boards, the splinters pressing against her thin clothing. The discomfort was immediate, the hardness of the wood a cruel contrast to the warmth she imagined in her final prayers. Her crucifix remained clutched in her trembling hand, the only remnant of her identity, the last fragment of self that hadn't been taken. The creaking of the cartwheels over stones and soil became a hypnotic rhythm, a slow, relentless cadence marking the start of her final passage. It was the sound of departure, the rhythm of her silent farewell to the simple world she had once loved. The cart lurched forward with a harsh jolt, and Alix, seated on the rough wooden boards, felt the vibration ripple through her weakened body, a physical discomfort that merged with the ache of her spirit. The slow, repetitive grind of the wheels over loose stones filled the air, the only sound breaking the heavy silence of her resignation. It was a dry, rhythmic groan, a funeral melody marking the pace of her final journey, away from the village, away from her life. She tightened her grip on the crucifix, focusing on the texture of the wood beneath her fingers as a way to drown out the pain and fear rising within her. Her eyes, now accustomed to the cold light, fixed on the oxen pulling the cart, their sluggish strength and patient endurance a mirror of her own fate. As the cart rolled slowly away from the prison walls, the familiar scent of hay and manure gave way to the drier smell of dust and wild rosemary growing along the roadside. It was an earthy, untamed fragrance that reminded her of open fields, of long days under the sun, far from cruelty and judgment. The change of air and space was startling. From the suffocating darkness of her cell, she was now exposed to the vast, indifferent world. The sight before her, rolling hills, cultivated land, the distant curve of the horizon, was a blend of beauty and loss, the world she would see one last time. The sun, pale and weak behind a veil of clouds, brushed her face with a fleeting warmth. She tried to hold on to that sensation, to store it within her memory, a final trace of life's tenderness. The slow pace of the cart and the steady rhythm of the wheels created a hypnotic lull, and Alix drifted into a half-conscious state where memory and reality intertwined. She tried to recall the sound of her own voice singing work songs while spinning wool, but the memory was faint and blurred. The only voice that remained was the quiet murmur of her soul, refusing even now to be silenced by cruelty. The coarse planks beneath her, scraping against her worn clothes, anchored her to the physical truth of her condition. A hard, unyielding reminder of a body still alive inside a fate already sealed. The journey wound slowly through fields and small clusters of peasant cottages. Alix watched the people bent over their work, their simple, harsh lives reflecting her own past. A calm melancholy filled her, a sense of belonging to a world that had betrayed her, but that she still loved in its essence. There was pain in her chest, yes, but also a strange peace, a final dignity and surrender, a cold serenity settling over her now that the height of her suffering had passed. Fray Tomas followed close behind on horseback, his dark cloak rippling against the pale sky, a shadow of authority and judgment cast across the landscape. Alex avoided looking at him, focusing instead on the road ahead and the ceaseless turn of the wheels. The smell of horse and leather drifting from him was the scent of power, distant and detached, a sharp contrast to the clean simplicity of the countryside she was leaving behind. His presence was a living reminder of the force that had condemned her, and its weight hung over her like a moving shadow. Along the road, the cart passed small rural chapels and weathered stone crosses, symbols of the same faith that had condemned her and the same faith that still sustained her. The irony stung deeply. Her unshaken belief was her only defense against a system that had used belief as a weapon. She pressed the crucifix tighter in her hand, her personal emblem of devotion standing quietly against the grand, impersonal symbols of the church that dotted the landscape. The wheels kept turning, slow and relentless, carrying her toward her final destination, her last and unavoidable journey. The cottages they passed, with their thatched roofs and wattle and daub walls, reflected the medieval custom of shared warmth. Families and livestock living together in a single room through winter nights. That image of humble intimacy stood in stark contrast to the cold isolation she had endured in the cell. Seeing those houses, so much like her own, filled her with a faint aching nostalgia, a tenderness for a life irretrievably lost. When the cart jolted violently over a protruding stone, the shock snapped her back to the present. Pain spread through her frail body, yet her mind remained steady, almost tranquil, a serenity born not of hope, but of acceptance. The rough creak of the wheels grinding against stone was now her only companion, the rhythm of her farewell, a soft, unspoken goodbye to the world she had loved in its simple, fleeting grace. Our focus now shifts away from the monotonous landscape and the creaking of the cart to an intimate, repetitive gesture of Alex, one that reveals the depth of her bond with the small crucifix. Her thumb, calloused and rough from years of spinning wool and working the soil, moved slowly and methodically over the worn shape of the wooden cross. It was a silent, tactile prayer, a way of keeping her mind anchored in the pure simplicity of her faith, of resisting the swirl of fear and injustice invading her thoughts. The repetition of this movement, almost unconscious, created its own rhythm, a gentle cadence that contrasted with the cart's harsh and uneven jolts. The feel of the wood, smooth in places from use, rough along the edges, was her only sensory comfort, her final link to the life that had been stolen from her. The crucifix was more than a religious symbol. It was a family possession, a tangible piece of authentic medieval peasant life. Few rural families owned devotional objects so lasting or personal, and their passing from generation to generation, like this wooden piece, turned them into talismans against the hardships of life, proofs of faith and belonging within a community. Its presence in Alex's hand, at that moment of condemnation, was an act of cultural and spiritual resistance, a simple object standing against the oppressive grandeur of the tribunal and its machinery of power. Its touch connected her to the memory of her mother and her husband, the only family she had left in the darkness of her fate. Alex could still sense the faint trace of old incense rising from the wood, a scent of church and celebration mingling with the smells of dust and sweat from the road. This contrast of fragrances mirrored her own condition, where pure faith and simple devotion were crushed beneath the weight of institutional cruelty. Her contemplation of the wooden piece, worn down, almost shapeless, became a slow, poetic meditation on an object that now held her entire universe. Her breathing, deep and steady, followed the rhythm of her thumb tracing the cross. It was her only melody, her lullaby amid terror and uncertainty. When the cart jolted over a hole in the road, she gripped the crucifix more tightly, feeling the pain shoot up her spine. Yet her mind stayed fixed on the sensation of the wood, a single point of both pain and comfort. She watched the faint morning light glimmer on its polished surface, a soft, fragile light that gave her a fleeting sense of hope, a promise of an end to her suffering. Her acceptance of fate carried with it a quiet sense of belonging to a world of suffering and faith, a silent brotherhood of souls who, like her, had been crushed by power and injustice. That simple gesture, her thumb tracing the cross, was her most intimate and revealing habit, an act of devotion that became her final form of communication with the world. It was a wordless message of faith and resistance that only she could understand. The slow, repetitive creak of the cart became the rhythm of her farewell, a dry, constant sound carrying her steadily toward her final destination. And though her body had been broken and her truth silenced, her soul remained at peace, rooted in the simplicity of a small wooden cross and the familiar motion of her thumb. It was her last and ultimate victory over the system that had condemned her. Alex's touch on the crucifix wasn't merely a gesture of devotion, it was an act of deep focus, a way of enduring the cold, stony surface of the cart's wall pressing against her back. The chill of the stone spread through her body, blending with the crisp morning air. Touch had become her dominant sense, her only way to stay connected to something tangible, a contrast to the abstract horror of her condemnation for witchcraft. The feel of the worn wood against her skin brought comfort, a small point of imagined warmth she tried to magnify through sheer willpower, a silent physical act of resistance against the oppressive world around her. As she held it tighter, the cross seemed to merge with her palm, its contours becoming an extension of her own body, her one remaining possession of intimate belonging, a link the Inquisition had failed to take from her. The cart continued its slow march forward, and the steady creaking of wheels and swaying timbers created a hypnotic rhythm that lulled Alex into a melancholic trance. The Inquisitor, Fray Tomas, riding at a respectful distance, heard only the muffled thud of his horse's hooves and the dry whisper of wind passing through the trees, a silence that to him was the sound of peace and order restored. It was a calm, born from his belief that he had purified Alex's soul through confession. This contrast in sound, the heavy, oppressive rhythm of the cart that defined Alex's reality, and the self-satisfied silence of Fray Tomas, was the essence of the injustice unfolding along that dusty road, a slow, inevitable march toward the end. Alex's gaze rested on her own hands, their skin rough and stained with traces of soil, a visual record of the honest, hard labor that had defined her life, a life she had been forced to deny in her confession. She noticed the small scars and calluses, the quiet marks of her humanity and her devotion to the land. Those marks were her unspoken proof of innocence, a truth written on her body that stood in violent contrast to the lie inscribed on the tribunal's parchment. The smell of dust and dry earth rising with every jolt of the cart became the scent of farewell, a final breath of the countryside she had loved and would never again feel as a free woman. Her habit of tracing the cross with her thumb was no longer just an act of piety. It was a story of resistance, a quiet assertion of dignity amid humiliation, a moment of serenity within the chaos of her fate. The slowness and repetition of the motion became her way of stretching time, of living each instant with painful yet peaceful intensity. The sense of belonging that came from the touch of the crucifix was her last victory over the system that had crushed her. A belonging to a faith and a memory that were hers alone, untouchable and eternal. Her acceptance of her fate had turned into a mystery of cold peace, a calm surrender that followed the peak of fear and pain. The slow progress of the cart carrying Alex began to approach a small nearby town. its sturdier houses of brick and stone marking a shift from the isolated rural landscape to a semi-urban centre where the authority of both crown and church was more direct and organised. The sight of clustered buildings, their slanted roofs and the bell tower dominating the skyline, stood in stark contrast to the simplicity of her village. It brought Alex a painful awareness that her personal suffering was about to be absorbed into a collective event, a public spectacle of faith and forced justice. She could see the outlines of the main square, where, from rumours whispered in prison, she knew her fate would be sealed. The growing presence of people and movement along the road made her realize that her private story was now to be consumed and amplified by the grand narrative of the Inquisition. The creaking of the cart now mingled with the distant sounds of the town, the murmur of voices, dogs barking, and the metallic rhythm of a blacksmith hammering at his anvil, a steady, living pulse of a world that carried on, indifferent to her fate. The smell of burning wood, fresh bread and stables drifted through the air, richer and more complex than anything she had sensed for weeks. It was the scent of communal life, a reminder of her own daily routine, and that sensory abundance was almost unbearable because it represented the nearness of life she would never again touch. Fray Tomas, the Inquisitor, adjusted his cloak and urged his horse slightly forward, preparing for the formal entrance into the town, where his presence and the carts would become the centre of attention, the beginning of the orchestrated display of faith and power that the Inquisition so carefully staged. Alex's story, once confined to the darkness of her cell, was now unfolding on a public stage. Her forced confession and unjust sentence were no longer only her own. They were part of the machinery through which fear and social control were imposed upon the community. Her frail, resigned figure on the cart became the visible emblem of the Church's vengeance against heresy and deviation, a demonstration of authority meant to intimidate and discipline anyone harboring doubt or unorthodox practice. Her personal suffering was transformed into a lesson of religious pedagogy, a solemn public warning about the consequences of defying the established order. This reflects a historical truth about the social, economic, and religious function of medieval autos da fe. They were not merely executions, but grand ceremonies of power and forced cohesion. The small crucifix in Alex's hand, her intimate focus of contemplation, stood in sharp contrast to the vastness and complexity of the town drawing near. Her touch upon the wood was her way of preserving a simple, pure identity amid the chaos and public scrutiny that awaited her. Her slow, steady breathing was her only defense against the panic threatening to seize her weakened body. She felt the roughness of the cart beneath her, the morning chill stinging her face, and her gaze fell upon the people gathering along the roadside to witness the procession. Curious and fearful faces stared back, an audience and a jury at once, seeing not Alex the peasant but Alex the witch, the title the Inquisition had branded upon her. Her condemnation, built upon lies extracted under coercion, was not only the loss of her life, but also the erasure of her name and her memory within the community. Her story of honesty and hard work was being replaced by the official narrative of guilt. Her silent acceptance of fate, which to her was resignation, was interpreted by Fray Tomas as repentance, a sign of submission that only strengthened the system's legitimacy and his own conviction. It was a terrible cycle of self-justification, where innocence could never be proven, and confession was the only path to so-called spiritual salvation. As the cart drew closer to the entrance of the town, Alex could hear the growing noise, a mix of excited voices and the low murmur of the crowd that had already gathered along the dusty roadside. That collective sound, the voice of the community watching her, deepened her isolation, turning her suffering into a public performance. She could feel the air grow denser and warmer from the press of bodies around her, a human heat that brought no comfort, only the weight and scrutiny of countless eyes. The scent of dust and earth stirred by footsteps and wheels now mingled with the odors of wine, olives, and sweat from the crowd, a complex aroma of medieval urban life that stood in sharp contrast to the simple, musty air of her cell. Fray Tomas, still mounted on his horse, subtly moved ahead of the cart. Wrapped in his dark cloak, his figure became the visual center of the procession, the embodiment of unshakable authority, preparing to execute divine justice. He spoke quietly to his assistants, giving final instructions on how to organize the crowd and conduct the public reading of the sentence. It was a detail tied to a social and religious custom of the time. The publicity and ceremony of the auto da fe were essential to its moral effect. The edict of condemnation was read aloud to ensure that the message of fear and discipline reached everyone present, reinforcing the institution's power over both faith and conscience. In the cart, Alex clutched the crucifix with renewed intensity, her thumb tracing the worn cross, a gesture that was her only means of maintaining composure amid the panic threatening to overtake her frail body. She saw the faces of the crowd flash past, some filled with fear, others with pity, and a few with cruel satisfaction. That collective gaze was her final and deepest humiliation, a rejection that went beyond her legal sentence, cutting into her very humanity and dignity. The sound of the cartwheels, which had once lulled her into a steady, meditative rhythm, now grew louder and more jarring, a harsh announcement of her arrival at the stage of her execution. The jolting intensified as the vehicle rolled onto the uneven cobblestones of the town, each bump sending a wave of pain through her bones. Feeling the ache and the discomfort, Alex breathed deeply, focusing on the air filling her lungs, a desperate effort to remain calm and composed amidst chaos and pressure. It was a subtle contrast between the outer violence of the procession and her inner stillness, her last, fragile refuge of dignity that she fought to preserve until the end. Her frail, resigned figure seated on the cart had become a living symbol of the Inquisition's power, a haunting lesson about the fate of those who dared defy order. Her forced confession, extracted under torture, was the very proof the system needed to justify its violence, a terrible irony in which falsehood became the foundation of both legal and religious truth. Alex, the peasant, was now the witch the community required to validate its fears and its faith. Her individual story was no longer hers. It was absorbed and crushed beneath the collective and institutional machinery of terror. As the cart entered the town's main square, it came to a halt, and the creaking of its wheels stopped abruptly, giving way to a heavy, tense silence that settled over the crowd, a dramatic pause that was an integral part of the Inquisition's public ritual. Sitting on the hard wooden plank, Alex felt her body relax slightly as the jarring motion ceased. The open air of the square, warmer and more expansive, carried the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed stone, a smell of permanence and history that stood in sharp contrast to her own fleeting existence. Her gaze lingered on the surrounding architecture, the stone facades of the houses with their small wrought-iron balconies and the austere church building whose massive oak doors seemed to watch the spectacle with cold indifference. The stillness that followed the cart's stop was a forced moment of contemplation, a pause in which terror became static and visible. Alex used that silence to deepen her touch on the crucifix, her thumb tracing the worn cross even more slowly, a diminished rhythm that anchored her to the fragile peace within. She could hear the muffled murmur of the crowd, a low blend of anticipation and fear, and in the distance, the rhythmic tolling of a bell marking the hour, a melancholy sound that measured the official time of her condemnation. This small cultural detail reflected a medieval custom. For most people, the ringing of bells was the only way to tell time, their steady cadence the audible mark of ecclesiastical and social order. Her mind, calmed by the stillness, wandered to a simple habit from her village. Women used to leave small offerings of dried flowers and hard bread at the stone crosses at crossroads, a gesture of humble devotion and protection against the evil eye. That quiet, earthy faith contrasted violently with the solemnity and oppressive grandeur of the inquisitorial ritual. Her gaze then fell on Fray Tomás, who dismounted his horse with austere dignity, his imposing silence reinforcing the weight of the tribunal's authority. The Inquisitor stepped onto the improvised platform, a wooden stage built at the center of the square, and the sound of his boots on the planks cut sharply through the silence of the crowd. He unrolled the parchment of the sentence, a formal gesture that marked the beginning of the final act of the ritual. Alex felt a faint shift in the air's temperature as the sun broke briefly through the clouds, a thin ray of light falling across the hand that clutched her crucifix. It was a quiet, poetic image, a fleeting trace of calm and hope, her last and fragile connection to the light. The silence that enveloped the crowd was so deep that Alex could hear the beating of her own heart, a faint but steady sound, the only rhythm left to her. Her acceptance of fate was a mystery of cold peace, a calm surrender that became her final act of dignity, her last silent resistance against the system that had crushed her. The soft beam of sunlight resting on her hand was her final comfort, her wordless farewell to the world. The silence in the square was so tangible that Alex could almost feel its texture, dry and heavy, thick, with the scent of dust and damp old stone. That smell mingled with the strong, earthy aroma of a small pile of firewood she could see at the center of the square, the wood prepared for her final fate. The sight of those unevenly cut logs, their pale, fresh color stark against the grey stones, became a visual focus of terror and resignation. Yet she tried to avert her gaze, fixing instead on the movement of her thumb, tracing the crucifix, her silent gesture of intimate resistance and devotion. That small object was her tactile anchor, the last link to her faith, which the Inquisition had twisted to justify her condemnation. On the platform, Fray Tomás began unrolling the parchment of her sentence. The dry, hissing sound of the stretched material was the only noise to pierce the crowd's tense stillness. The Inquisitor coughed lightly, a sharp, authoritative sound that seized everyone's attention. His voice, calm, cold, and amplified by the silence of the square, began to read the accusations, a detailed and terrible list of the crimes Alex had been forced to confess. The rhythm of the reading was slow and methodical, prolonging both the suffering and the spectacle, turning lies into public and legal truth. This connects to a subtle cultural note, the solemnity and pedagogical purpose of the auto da fe, designed to instruct through fear. In the cart, Alex felt the weak warmth of the sun on her face, a fleeting heat that brought a hint of comfort, yet stood in cruel contrast to the chill in Fray Tomás's words condemning her to death in the name of a merciful God. She closed her eyes, focusing on the Inquisitor's voice, which sounded distant and impersonal, an abstract authority that had nothing to do with her life or her truth. She used the slow, steady rhythm of his reading as a kind of mantra, a sound that carried her inward towards stillness, her last fragile sense of dignity. Her habit of tracing the cross had become her only act of rebellion, a silent, private resistance against the official narrative of her guilt. The touch of the wooden crucifix was her proof of innocence, a truth felt through the fingers that no parchment could erase. The gentle, poetic image of sunlight resting on her hand was her final comfort, her wordless farewell to the world. Her acceptance of fate was a mystery of cold peace, a calm surrender that followed the peak of fear and pain, a feeling of belonging to a silent community of victims. The silence surrounding her was her last refuge, a moment of contemplative stillness in which she could remember her simple, honest life, the small human story being crushed beneath the machinery of the Inquisition. Her slow, steady breathing was the only sound left to her. Our perspective now shifts abruptly from the resigned figure of Alex in the cart to the silent crowd watching her. A sea of tense, curious faces filling the square, where the voice of Fray Thomas reading the sentence was the only sound rising above the muffled murmur. Among those faces was that of a young cloth merchant named Etienne, about 25 years old, who had come from the nearby town of La Senda to buy wool. He had ended up there by chance, drawn by the gathering and the solemnity of the auto da fe, a public spectacle of fear and faith. His presence offered an outsider's view, one less burdened by local fear and more guided by the curiosity of a traveler, allowing him to see the scene with a different clarity. He noticed the stark contrast between the fragility of the accused and the overwhelming grandeur of the inquisitorial display, a contrast that became the focus of his silent contemplation. Etienne could smell the strong, sweet aroma of spices he carried in his leather satchels, cinnamon and cloves, scents of trade and of the wider world that contrasted with the dust and sweat of the crowd. That smell of commerce separated him from the closed, fearful mindset of the village. He watched Alex's small, hunched figure in the cart, his eyes drawn to her repeated gesture of clutching the wooden crucifix, a detail that unsettled him deeply. Her devotion seemed genuine, profound, utterly incompatible with the image of a witch and servant of the devil that Fray Tomas was describing with such conviction as he read the sentence. The contradiction stirred unease in Etienne's mind, a silent question amid the overwhelming certainty of the tribunal and the crowd. The young merchant, accustomed to the rhythms of trade and the need for discernment in judging the truth of words and the quality of goods, noticed the stiffness and formality of Fray Tomas's language. His long, elaborate sentences filled with Latin and theological terms that most listeners could barely grasp. This excess of erudition struck Etienne as suspicious, a cloak of authority concealing a lack of compassion and humanity. The Inquisitor's calm, professional tone, as he described horrors and pacts with the devil, contrasted sharply with Alex's resigned silence, and this opposition of voices was the quiet proof of the injustice unfolding in the square, a small human story of observation and doubt amid dogmatic certainty. Etienne recalled a brief story he'd heard in La Senda about a peasant accused of theft who had confessed under the threat of torture, only to later proclaim his innocence after release, admitting that his confession had been a desperate escape from pain. The memory mirrored Alex's situation and deepened Etienne's mistrust of forced confessions. His keen sense of touch, honed from years of judging the quality of fabric and wool, felt the rough texture of his own thick cloak, a familiar sensation grounding him in reality. Yet the weak morning sun and the chill of the stone beneath his feet anchored him in that present moment of dread. Etienne's gaze on the scene was not one of pity, but of intellectual unrest, a growing suspicion that the justice of that tribunal was not truth, but merely its construction. The sight of the crucifix in Alex's hand, her last desperate anchor of faith, etched itself into his memory, a symbol of silent resistance he would carry back with him to La Senda. It became a weight of conscience and doubt that set him apart from the crowd and its passive acceptance of the spectacle. His slow, steady breathing was his way of keeping calm amid the chaos and injustice unfolding before his eyes. Etienne, the cloth merchant, felt the rough texture of his virgin wool cloak brushing against his neck, a physical touch grounding him in his own reality and trade. He watched Alex's pale, resigned face, noting the absence of hysteria or violent despair. Her calmness, in the mindset of the time, might have been seen as the devil's coldness, but to him, an outside observer, it looked only like total exhaustion and the acceptance of an unjust fate. The sound of Fray Tomas's voice, continuing to read the clauses about the confiscation of Alex's property by the Crown and the Inquisition, echoed across the square, a sound of legal authority and economic appropriation that deepened Etienne's suspicion about the true motives behind the ritual. It seemed as much about material gain as it was about spiritual punishment. The smell of cheap incense and sweat rising from the Inquisitor's assistants mixed with the aroma of spices Etienne carried, cinnamon and cloves. He sensed the clash between these two olfactory worlds. On one side, the scent of institutional faith and fear. On the other, the scent of commerce, risk and adventure. It was a clear divide between the rigidity of this rural world and the fluidity of the mercantile one he represented. The sight of Fray Tomas, upright, composed and unwavering in conviction, made him the center of the ceremony, a man who truly believed that his cruelty was a form of divine mercy. It revealed a deeper perspective on the moral complexity of inquisitors themselves. With eyes trained to judge the quality of goods, the merchant noticed the simplicity of the crucifix in Alex's hand, the worn, worthless wood that held no material value. That humble object stood in sharp contrast to the rich ecclesiastical ornaments and the formal parchment of the Inquisition, a symbol of pure, personal faith against bureaucratic and ostentatious devotion. The contrast only strengthened his belief in the peasant woman's innocence. His slow, steady breathing was his way of staying calm and processing the injustice before him, a meditative rhythm that distanced him from the suppressed hysteria of the crowd. The chill morning air brushing against his skin, even beneath the heavy cloak, was a physical reminder of the system's relentless coldness. Etienne's intimate gaze fixed on the movement of Alex's thumb over the crucifix, a repetitive act of devotion that became her small human story of silent resistance, her final act of dignity that defied the image of witchcraft imposed upon her. The merchant, not a man of zealous faith, felt a deep empathy for her, a quiet solidarity that became his way of opposing injustice. Her calm resignation was, to him, a mystery of cold peace, a composed surrender that marked her last and ultimate victory over terror. His new perspective, that of a traveler and observer, would lead him to doubt the legitimacy of forced confessions and to question the justice of the system. It was a burden of conscience he would carry with him on his journey home, turning his brief witness of that auto da fe into a lesson about the nature of power and truth. The dry, steady cadence of the Inquisitor's voice, reading the final condemnation, became, for Etienne, the rhythm of his silent departure from the square and the beginning of a new awareness of the world's cruelty. The square, once sunk in tense silence, began to fill with sound again, a rising sensory tide that served as the prelude to tragedy. From her place in the cart, Alex could now hear the dry, rhythmic thud of a hammer striking wood, a steady, oppressive noise coming from the spot where the pyre was being built. It was the sound of her scaffold taking form, the heartbeat of her sentence turning into reality, and that relentless rhythm invaded her fragile inner calm, tightening her chest with mounting dread. The touch of her crucifix grew more urgent, her thumb tracing the cross faster and harder, the frantic motion an attempt to drown out the pounding hammer and the quickening of her own pulse. The scent of pine resin and fresh-cut wood thickened in the air, a sharp, penetrating aroma blending with the cold smoke and incense that drifted through the square. It was the smell of death and ritual, a nauseating mix that sent waves of physical discomfort through her body. Alex's gaze locked onto the timid flames beginning to flicker at the base of the pile, a trembling orange and yellow light that mesmerized her eyes. She could feel the faint warmth radiating through the morning chill, a warmth that promised both pain and release, a terrible paradox that consumed her. The wavering light cast ghostly shadows on the stone facades surrounding the square, a haunting display that deepened the sense of drama and fear. Etienne, the young merchant, watched the preparations with growing unease. His attention lingered on a curious medieval custom he remembered, the burning of aromatic herbs and incense during executions, meant to mask the smell of burning flesh and to purify the air of the evil the witch embodied. He could smell that same sweet, heavy incense now, blending with the scent of scorching wood, an odor of ritual and hypocrisy that stirred his disgust and a quiet sense of revolt. The voice of Fray Tomas rose above the crackle of the fire as he read aloud the articles of Alex's confession with theatrical emphasis, describing her supposed pacts with the devil and her nocturnal flights. His tone carried both authority and menace, turning the moment into a sermon of terror. For Alex, the touch of the crucifix was her only defense against the assault of the senses, the simple object serving as her refuge, both tactile and spiritual. Her thumb's motion across the cross was a silent act of devotion, an island of calm in the surrounding chaos. She drew slow, deliberate breaths, focusing on the air filling her lungs, willing herself to remain composed and serene amid the panic pressing in from all sides. Her acceptance of fate was a mystery of cold peace, a calm surrender that had become her final, quiet triumph over the system that had crushed her. The hammering stopped suddenly. A tense, expectant silence fell over the square, a breath held by hundreds. Alex, still in the cart, felt her heart pounding hard and uneven in her chest. The only sound left to her, an intimate, desperate rhythm mingling with the muffled murmur of the crowd. Her eyes fixed on the growing flames of the pyre, a fire that was now her final and inevitable home, an end she met with silent, unbroken dignity. The air in the square had become almost unbreathable for Alex as the smell of smoke thickened and the pine resin heated, releasing a sharp, acrid scent that filled her lungs and made her cough softly, a frail sound swallowed by the murmur of the crowd. She could feel the heat of the flames radiating closer, waves of warmth that brought dizziness and a primal physical fear. Yet her mind stayed anchored to the smooth, worn surface of her wooden crucifix, the only tactile comfort she had, her spiritual anchor in that moment of terror and surrender. Her thumb moved across the cross in a quick, almost frantic rhythm, a gesture of intimate devotion that stood in stark contrast to the violence of the scene unfolding around her. Etienne, the merchant, could hear the subtle sounds of the Inquisitor's assistants fastening the peasant woman to the stake, the squeak of tightening leather straps, the dry click of iron clasps, noises that blended with the crackle of kindling and the low hum of the crowd, a sound heavy with expectation and restrained horror. The thick scent of incense grew stronger, meant to purify the air, and this ritualistic, hypocritical fragrance deepened his mistrust of the justice being carried out. He recalled a curious medieval custom, a small social detail, that in some regions people avoided touching the rope used to bind a condemned witch, fearing that bad luck or the spirit of the sorcerer might cling to them. It revealed the depth of superstition and fear surrounding the figure of the witch, even after her judgment had been pronounced. Alex's eyes fixed on the flames as they climbed higher, a fire that had become her final inevitable home, and the crackling of burning wood was the rhythm of her silent farewell to the world. She drew long, deliberate breaths, focusing on the air entering her lungs, willing herself to remain calm and composed amid the panic threatening to consume her. The crucifix in her hand was her only shield against the assault of sensations, the noise, the heat, the stench, the terror, and its touch was her proof of faith and of humanity in the face of cruelty. Her acceptance of fate was a mystery of cold peace, a calm surrender that became her last quiet victory over the system that had crushed her, a dignity that defied the brutality of the spectacle. The rising roar of the fire and the growing intensity of its heat were the last sounds and sensations Alex felt. Her mind was fixed entirely on the crucifix's touch, the final link to her faith and her humanity. Her small human story came to an end, crushed beneath the machinery of the Inquisition and the weight of lies, but her silent resistance and her final dignity remained her ultimate, undeniable triumph over terror. The atmosphere in the square shifted slowly and almost imperceptibly, a gradual change in both light and emotional temperature that deepened the sense of solemnity. The weak morning sun, which had struggled to break through the clouds, was now swallowed by a dense, unexpected fog, drifting down from the nearby mountains. A sudden weather change that dimmed the light and chilled the air, thickening the sensation of cold and dampness. Alex, already bound to the stake at the center of the square, felt the roughness of the rope tightening around her wrists and the cold touch of the wooden post pressing against her back, sensations that became the sharpest anchors of her physical awareness. The smell of smoke, once strong and acrid, grew softer and heavier in the mist, blending the sense of burning wood and moist air, a transformation that added an undertone of melancholy to the moment. The crackling of the firewood feeding the flames slowed in rhythm, becoming almost hypnotic, a sound that to Alex felt like a distant whisper. That slower cadence lulled her into a state of deep resignation and calm surrender. She closed her eyes, focusing on the feel of the crucifix that the guards had allowed her to keep in hand, an apparent act of mercy that was, in truth, a gesture of religious formality. Her thumb traced the cross with an almost imperceptible slowness, a movement that matched her inner rhythm, her final connection to the world and to her faith, a quiet, private defiance against the system that had condemned her. As the fog thickened, it wrapped the square in an otherworldly veil, turning reality into something dreamlike, where her impending death seemed to blur into illusion and reverie. Soft, recurring thoughts, her steadfast innocence and the falsehood of her confession echoed gently in her mind, forming a silent mantra that upheld her dignity and inner peace. She remembered her small garden, the rows of garlic and medicinal herbs, the scent of fresh soil and morning dew, the fragrance of her honest life. That memory, vivid and pure, stood in stark contrast to the smell of smoke and death surrounding her. It became her final wordless protest against injustice. Fray Tomas, the Inquisitor, stood on the platform watching the fog descend with a grave expression, interpreting the phenomenon as a sign of divine presence. Proof in his eyes that heaven itself had come to cleanse the town of the evil Alex embodied. Thus, the scene's emotional temperature shifted once more, cruelty now cloaked in mysticism and religious fervor. The worn wood of the crucifix, now cold and damp from the mist, was her only tactile comfort, a simple object that held infinite meaning amid her suffering. Alex felt the chill seeping into her body, yet her mind remained serene, her calm surrender becoming her final act of dignity and her quiet victory over terror. The crowd, now blurred and ghostly through the fog, seemed to drift away. Their murmurs faded into a distant, unintelligible hum. That soft withdrawal of sound and sight wrapped her in a sensory isolation that led her gently toward peace, a natural, slow closing of her world. The scent of damp earth and pine resin, now softened and thickened by the fog that blanketed the square, created an atmosphere of sensory isolation. Alex felt the world slowly receding, leaving her alone within her quiet inner space. The light had shifted to a muted grey, diffused and hazy, turning the shapes of the crowd into indistinct shadows. Her gaze settled on her own body, bound to the stake and on the small crucifix in her hand, her single point of light and truth amid darkness and imposed lies. The touch of the wood, cold yet familiar, was her only tactile comfort, a fragile thread linking her to her unwavering faith. The slow, hypnotic rhythm of the crackling wood was the only living sound left to her, a faint whisper from afar that lulled her into a deep calm and resignation. She recalled a curious fragment of rural folklore, the belief that sudden cold fog carried the spirits of the dead. She could almost feel those silent presences moving through the chilled air around her, not as a threat, but as a strange, soothing company, as though she were being guided toward peace, away from human cruelty and injustice. The repeated image of the crucifix in her hand, the only belonging she still possessed, became her silent mantra, her last act of devotion and inner defiance against the system that had crushed her. Her slow, measured breathing formed her inner rhythm, the sound of her soul finding final peace through acceptance. The slow shift of light and air created an atmosphere of stillness and farewell, where her final dignity stood as her ultimate and undeniable triumph over fear. The coarse rope around her wrists and the chill of the wooden post against her back were her last sensations of pain, yet her mind remained serene and steady, focused only on the worn smoothness of the crucifix in her palm. Her acceptance of fate was a mystery of cold peace, a calm surrender that followed the peak of terror and agony, a quiet sense of belonging to a vast unseen community of victims who, like her, had been crushed beneath power and injustice. As the fire's crackle grew slightly louder and its warmth crept closer, signaling the approaching climax of the tragedy, Alex remained motionless in her stillness, wrapped in a serene, cold peace that became her final refuge, her silent farewell to the world. The dense fog that had blanketed the square began slowly to dissolve, like a veil being lifted, and the grey, diffused light of late morning turned slightly brighter, a shift in illumination that deepened the atmosphere of solemn reflection. Alex, bound to the stake, felt the air grow drier as the mist's moisture evaporated, and that dry air, heavy with the lingering scents of pine smoke and incense, carried with it a new thermal sensation, the gradual warmth of the approaching flames, a heat that signaled the prelude to the end. Her sense of touch registered the pressure of the rope cutting into her wrists and the roughness of the wooden post against her back. Yet her mind focused only on the soft, familiar feel of the crucifix in her hand. The crackling of the fire grew louder, steadier, its rhythm now the only living sound left to her, a sound announcing her release from pain and injustice. She drew a deep breath, concentrating on the air filling her lungs, her last attempt to preserve calm and serenity in the face of physical terror. Her gaze fixed on the rising flames, their orange and yellow hues mesmerizing her eyes, and she found herself remembering, almost unconsciously, the image of the hearth fire in her small village home, the only warmth and safety she had ever known, a terrible contrast to the fire that now surrounded her. Her thoughts turned inward, creating an atmosphere of stillness and reflection, leading her to recall the simplest, purest moments of her life, the smell of fresh earth after rain, the sound of the church bells in her village, memories that helped her preserve her honest and humble identity until the very end. She recalled one last fragment of folklore, a peasant belief that before death the soul would visit the places it had loved most. In that instant, she felt her spirit drifting over her garden and her home, a silent, intimate farewell to the world that had betrayed her, yet one she still loved for its simple beauty. Her final dignity and her calm acceptance of fate created a serene expectation of the end, a mystery of cold peace settling in after the peak of fear and pain. The feel of the crucifix beneath her thumb became her last act of devotion, her final quiet defiance against the system that had destroyed her. The roar of the flames and the growing heat were the last sensations she knew, and her mind remained fixed on the crucifix's touch, her final link to faith and to humanity, a silent, undeniable victory over terror. The smell of burning pine and fresh firewood had become the dominant scent in the square, an intense fragrance that filled Alex's nostrils, blending with the incense that the Inquisitor's assistants kept burning to purify the air of evil. Her gaze fixed on the flames licking the base of the woodpile, the orange light dancing and rising, and she felt the heat creeping toward her body, a warmth that was both a promise of pain and an end to her suffering and injustice. Her sense of touch registered the crucifix's cold, rough surface, her last humble belonging, a contrast between her pure faith and the fire consuming her in its name. The crackling of the wood was the only sound she could hear, a steady, rhythmic noise that carried her deeper into her inner stillness, a forced, melancholic meditation. Fragments of her past returned to her, the voice of her lost husband, the sound of the church bells in her village, the scent of fresh bread and dew from her garden, memories that stood as her final defense against the Inquisition's machinery and the false confession it had wrung from her. Her mind was calm and still, her resignation now her final act of dignity and quiet resistance against the system that had destroyed her. On the platform, Inquisitor Fray Tomás made his last gestures of authority, his calm, professional voice delivering the final prayers, a solemn sound of faith and terror rising above the fire's growing roar. In the crowd, the merchant Etienne watched the scene with growing unease, his eyes drawn to the crucifix in Alex's hand. Her last link to humanity, a symbol of unshakable faith standing in stark contrast to the cruelty unfolding before him. Her acceptance of fate was a mystery of cold peace, a calm surrender following the summit of fear and pain, a silent belonging to a vast community of the condemned. Her final dignity, expressed through her stillness and her gentle hold on the crucifix, created a quiet expectation of the end, a moment of reflection and forced contemplation in which her soul prepared for its silent farewell. The flames, rising higher, became her last and inevitable home, a fate she accepted with serene resignation, her final and undeniable victory. The fire surrounding Alex no longer roared with its first fury. Now it breathed in long, uneven waves, as if the world itself inhaled and exhaled with her. The crackling wood whispered through the smoke, marking the rhythm of her fading heartbeat. The air shimmered, trembling under the heat's invisible pulse. It was alive, yet dying. The square stood still, watching life dissolve into sound. The wood snapped with dry, uneven clicks, each one echoing like a distant heartbeat. They drifted into Alex's mind, softening into the melody of an unseen lullaby. Every spark was a fleeting note, every ember a sigh of time itself. The rhythm calmed her even as it burned. The fire had found its voice, and it sang her farewell. Around her, the air wavered in waves of heat and shadow. The warmth came and went like a living thing, an embrace, a retreat, a breath. The burned air tangled with threads of cold wind, weaving a tapestry of pain and release. Alex felt suspended between two worlds, one of agony, one of mercy. The flames hesitated as if they pitied her. The heat licked her skin, only to be met by the soft chill of wind across her face. Each gust carried a memory, the touch of rain-soaked fields, the scent of her husband's hands, the echo of laughter in the mill. The pain no longer belonged to her body. The fire devoured flesh, but her spirit had already stepped away. Death, when it came, was quiet. She didn't cry, not from courage, but because her body had forgotten how. The fire had taken her tears before it touched her skin. Her face, calm and unflinching, looked more alive than any soul watching her burn. Her breath slowed until it became invisible, and within that stillness, faith quietly remained. The crucifix, hot against her palm, felt like a pulse of its own. Metal and wood merged into her flesh, glowing with unbearable tenderness. The sweet scent of burning resin mixed with smoke and prayer, pain and devotion, became indistinguishable. Alex held it tighter, as if belief could outlast fire. In her fractured awareness, the smoke became a prayer, thick, heavy, ascending like a living thing. Each curl of grey was a whisper, each spark a confession. It rose slowly toward the heavens, carrying truth that words could no longer bear. She imagined the smoke reaching her mother's hands. In that image, she found peace. The square around her hung in reverent silence, time frozen between two heartbeats. Faces stared, but did not blink, bound by the gravity of the moment. The fire threw their shadows against the stone walls, distorting them into monstrous silhouettes. Even fear seemed sacred. The sound of burning had become the only passage of time. The houses around the square glowed with trembling orange light, their windows flickering like the eyes of silent witnesses. Iron railings gleamed as if newly forged. Heat shimmered across the cobblestones, bending the air itself. Ordinary walls became altars, and the flames their offerings. In that glow, holiness and horror were one. Etienne stood motionless, watching as though seeing a truth too large for human understanding. The light carved his face into copper and shadow, his heart clenched with guilt he couldn't name. The silence weighed heavier than the smoke. Somewhere deep inside, he understood that this wasn't justice, it was theater. The air thickened, every breath carried the taste of ash and pine. It was like swallowing the residue of faith itself, bitter, dry, suffocating. The square smelled of sanctity and ruin. Etienne pressed a hand against his chest, feeling the wild rhythm beneath. The heartbeat reminded him he was still among the living. Then the bells began to toll, 3 long, low notes rolling through the air. Their sound wove with the crackle of fire like 2 competing hymns. Etienne shut his eyes. To him it was a requiem. Alex heard only the echo through her ribs, but felt the peace it carried. The bells were her release, her last measure of time. The flames answered in rhythm, leaping higher with each toll. Their light pulsed like breath, alive, defiant. The crowd lowered their heads in involuntary reverence. Even the wind paused for a heartbeat. The fire was no longer punishment. It was ritual. A gust rose from the north, scattering sparks across the night like fragments of stars. Each one floated weightlessly before vanishing in the mist. Etienne followed their ascent, imagining them as freed souls. The fire shrank, but its light brightened. The moment hovered eternal and unresolvable. The scent of pine turned soft and melancholy, resin sweetened by heat. Smoke rose in thin white columns, ghostly and serene. The morning fog folded into it, blurring sky and earth together. A pale slit of blue appeared through the clouds. Somewhere beyond the square, life still moved. The roar had faded into a whisper, a soft murmur against the silence. No one in the crowd dared to move or speak. Only the crackling wood and the faint hiss of smoke remained. Death had become a prayer shared by all. Even the wind seemed to breathe in reverence. Ashes began to dance, spiraling, rising, falling again like gentle snow. Some landed on Etienne's shoulders, warm and weightless. He didn't brush them away. To him they were sacred, remnants of something pure, the dust of faith, freer than the crowd that mourned her. Looking upward, Etienne saw the clouds part a little wider. A narrow shaft of light slipped through the smoke and touched the center of the square. It fell exactly where the flames burned low, illuminating what was left. It felt less like sunlight and more like acknowledgement. The sky had witnessed everything. The smoke ascended in shapes that almost resembled a human form. Etienne thought he saw Alex within it, light, weightless, unafraid. He closed his eyes, letting that image sink into him. The burden in his chest eased for a moment. He sensed a soul had just been freed. A faint murmur spread through the onlookers, neither grief nor relief, but something unnamed. Fray Tomas remained still upon the platform, cloaked in shadow. The wind stirred his robes but drew no response. Something in the flames had stripped the certainty from his faith. Even authority trembled. Ashes fell thicker now, settling over cloaks and faces. Children watched, mesmerized, not yet understanding death's choreography. To them, it was color and movement, like a fairground without joy. The adults turned away, ashamed to meet the fire's gaze. Fear and devotion made equal prisoners. There was something in Alex's stillness that unsettled them all. Her peace seemed to undo the very logic of punishment. Fray Tomas felt it too, a flicker of doubt crawling beneath his composure. The fire had revealed a truth his sermons never could. The flame burned through his certainty. He looked down at the parchment in his hands, the ink already curling in the heat. The words of judgment, once heavy with power, now felt hollow. He wanted to pray, but found no language left. Silence became his confession. His belief faltered like a candle guttering in wind. Etienne, still unmoving, stepped closer to the dying glow. He didn't know why, only that he needed proximity to what remained. Something invisible seemed to rise from the embers, something unspoken yet absolute. His eyes found the crucifix half buried in ash. That gesture alone was worth 1,000 scriptures. The square held its breath. No voices, no motion, only the slow exhale of smoke retreating into the sky. Shadows folded inward, and the light dimmed into stillness. In that silence, injustice lost its name, and for a single sacred heartbeat, the world understood. The fire had died, leaving behind only a faint shimmer of heat over the smoldering wood. The air trembled with the residue of energy, a ghost of the blaze that had once devoured the morning. Smoke drifted low, curling lazily around the stones. The scent of pine lingered, rich and sweet, refusing to fade. The square, once full of noise, now seemed carved out of silence. The crowd stood motionless, uncertain of how to disperse, as if movement might desecrate the moment. Their faces were grey with ash, indistinguishable from one another. Some looked down, others stared into the smoke, searching for a sign. Faith had demanded this spectacle, yet no one felt closer to salvation. The silence pressed upon them like a stone. Fray Tomas remained on the wooden platform, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The parchment with Alex's sentence hung loosely from his fingers, its edges blackened by heat. He could still hear his own voice echoing, rehearsing divine justice. But now the echo felt hollow, stripped of conviction. The words that had condemned her no longer belonged to him. The Inquisitor looked toward the sky, where the smoke had already begun to scatter. It dissolved into pale ribbons of white, blending with thin clouds that drifted east. He imagined that somewhere within that vapor rose the truth he had tried to suppress. The wind carried it, indifferent and eternal. His faith, once solid, now trembled beneath its weight. Below him, the assistants began to collect the wooden remains, their faces blank and mechanical. The clatter of iron tools against stone broke the stillness in sharp intervals. Each sound pierced the air like a memory refusing to die. Their movements were precise, practiced, ritual without reverence. They worked quickly, avoiding one another's gaze. Etienne remained apart from the crowd, his eyes fixed on the dark circle where the fire had been. He felt neither horror nor disbelief, only a quiet exhaustion that hollowed his chest. The smell of burnt resin clung to his cloak, mingling with the faint spice of his trade. He inhaled deeply, memorizing the scent as if it were part of her story. This was the perfume of injustice. A thin wind swept through the square, carrying with it fine particles of ash. They danced briefly in the light before disappearing. The town seemed to exhale, a long, weary sigh that no one dared to voice. Doors creaked open in the distance. The day resumed, awkward and subdued, as though the earth itself had grown ashamed. Etienne turned away from the center, but his mind lingered. The image of Alex's hand clutching the crucifix returned, bright and painful. He could still see the faint motion of her thumb tracing the cross, the gesture that had defied everything. It had not been a plea. It was truth, condensed into movement. That memory burned more deeply than the fire itself. As he moved through the crowd, the townspeople avoided his eyes. Some made the sign of the cross, others pretended not to see him. Their piety felt like fear disguised as devotion. No one wished to be associated with memory. To forget was safer, cleaner, sanctioned. Etienne understood then how silence became complicity. A young boy, no older than 12, stood near the fountain watching him. His face was smudged with soot, his eyes wide with confusion rather than belief. Etienne paused, meeting the boy's gaze. For a moment he saw in it the reflection of doubt, a seed planted unknowingly. He nodded once, as if in blessing. The boy would remember what the others tried to erase. Fray Thomas finally descended from the platform, his steps slow, deliberate. Each one echoed on the stones like a confession whispered aloud. The crowd instinctively parted to make way for him. He passed through them without a word, his expression unreadable. The authority that once filled his posture now seemed like a heavy disguise. The Inquisitor paused by the remains of the fire. A single ember still glowed faintly among the ashes. He bent slightly, staring into it, and felt something unfamiliar, a pulse of humility. For the first time, he wondered whether God had been present at all. The ember flickered once, then died. The answer vanished with it. Etienne followed the edges of the square until he reached the narrow road leading out of town. Behind him, the murmurs of the dispersing crowd began to fade. The sound reminded him of waves retreating after a storm, gentle, exhausted, and ashamed. He walked slowly, unwilling to leave completely. His steps left faint prints in the dust. The sunlight had softened, filtered through the haze of smoke and mist. It touched the stones with a fragile warmth, as if the world itself sought forgiveness. Birds circled high above but did not sing. The town bell tolled once, more out of duty than mourning. It sounded thin and uncertain, its faith exhausted. Along the roadside, Etienne passed a small stone cross half hidden by weeds. Its base was cracked, but the carved Christ remained intact, weathered yet unbroken. He stopped and brushed away the dust with his sleeve. The gesture felt instinctive, not pious. "She believed in you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whom he addressed. The wind answered in silence. He sat for a while beside the cross, listening to the faint hum of the world returning to itself. Somewhere a cart rolled over cobblestones, its wheels echoing like distant thunder. The smell of earth replaced the scent of smoke. A faint peace settled over him, fragile but real. He closed his eyes, allowing the moment to breathe. When he rose again, he noticed a single black feather caught in the grass. It trembled slightly in the wind, refusing to take flight. Etienne picked it up, turning it between his fingers. It was warm from the sun, smooth and weightless. Somehow, it reminded him of Alex's final serenity, the same paradox of fragility and strength. He tucked the feather into the lining of his cloak and continued walking. The road curved gently toward the hills, bordered by low stone walls and clusters of rosemary. The air was cooler here, the smell of pine faint but persistent. Each step carried him farther from the square, yet deeper into reflection. The world beyond felt both free and wounded. Behind him, the town receded into a blur of smoke and stone. He didn't look back. There was no reason. The past had already burned. Ahead lay the open countryside, calm and indifferent, waiting. He breathed in the scent of wind and dust, tasting life again. Even silence had a flavor now. Along the way, Etienne encountered an old shepherd resting by the path. The man nodded in greeting, unaware of the fire that had shaped the morning. His sheep grazed quietly, their bells tinkling in rhythm. The simplicity of it struck Etienne with sudden force. Life continued, blind to its own cruelty. He envied that innocence. The shepherd offered him water from a leather flask. Etienne drank, feeling the coolness spread through his chest. The taste was earthy, clean, almost sacred. "You've come from town?" the old man asked. Etienne hesitated, then nodded. "A woman died today," he replied. The shepherd crossed himself and said nothing more. They sat together in silence, two strangers sharing the same stillness. Above them, clouds drifted apart, revealing the pale blue of afternoon. Etienne watched them move, slow and unhurried, and thought of smoke turning to sky. Maybe that was how truth survived, by changing form. He wondered if anyone else would ever understand. When he finally rose to leave, the shepherd simply said, "God sees everything." The words lingered in the air, gentle but uncertain. Etienne wanted to believe them, yet doubt had already taken root. He nodded politely and continued on. The road ahead shimmered faintly under the sun. By the time the hills swallowed the town from sight, he carried only three things: the scent of smoke, the feather in his cloak, and the memory of a woman who never screamed. The world seemed unchanged, yet everything felt different. Even the wind sounded thoughtful. It brushed against him like an invisible companion. As he walked farther, the bells from the town rang once more. Faint, distant, fading. He didn't stop or turn, he only listened. The echo followed him across the fields like a ghost of conscience. Somewhere behind, ash settled into the soil, feeding the earth that would bloom again. The world, indifferent and eternal, kept breathing. Etienne walked until the path narrowed into a valley of mist and wild rosemary. The scent of pine was softer here, mingling with the damp breath of the earth. Each step felt lighter, though his thoughts were heavy. The hills seemed to listen, echoing the faint toll of distant bells. He no longer knew whether it was memory or wind. The sky stretched pale and endless above him, washed clean of smoke. Patches of blue broke through drifting clouds like fragile windows. For the first time since morning, sunlight touched his face without guilt. He closed his eyes and let its warmth sink in. The world, uncaring and vast, offered him a kind of absolution. A small stream ran parallel to the path, its water clear and restless. He followed its murmuring for a while, listening to its rhythm replace the fire's crackle. The sound was alive, untamed, forgiving. He knelt to drink, and the chill of it startled him back into the present. Life, he realized, insisted on continuing. In the reflection of the stream, he saw his own face blurred by ripples. Ash still clung to his hair and cloak, small reminders of the morning. He wiped them away, though one grey streak refused to leave. It was as if the fire had branded him invisibly. The mark was not of sin, but of witness. Nearby, a cluster of wildflowers grew from the cracks between stones. Their petals were pale, trembling slightly in the breeze. Etienne crouched to touch them, surprised by their resilience. Even here, where the soil was thin and rough, beauty persisted. It was an act of quiet defiance, like hers. A faint sound behind him made him turn. A peasant woman was walking along the same path, carrying a basket of herbs on her back. Her pace was slow, deliberate, her face hidden by a scarf. When she passed him, she nodded silently. In her eyes, he saw the same tired knowing that now lived in him. "You came from the square?" she asked softly, her voice a blend of fear and pity. Etienne nodded. The woman sighed and adjusted her basket. "It's not the first," she murmured, "and it won't be the last." Her words hung in the air like smoke that refused to rise. He didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. They walked together for a short while, strangers bound by the same invisible sorrow. The path curved between olive trees and low stone walls. Each tree leaned slightly with age, their trunks twisted but strong. Life grew imperfectly, yet faithfully. The woman eventually turned toward a small chapel hidden among the trees. Before entering, she looked back at him. "If you remember her, pray for her," she said. "They burn the body, not the soul." Her voice trembled on the edge of conviction. Etienne inclined his head in silence. He knew prayer would never feel the same again. Still, he whispered her name once, just to keep it alive. Inside the chapel, faint candlelight flickered through the doorway. He could hear her footsteps echo softly on the stone floor. Etienne continued walking, the road stretching ahead like an unwritten page. The hills faded behind him, wrapped again in mist. The world seemed determined to forget, but he would not. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant fields, fresh hay, damp soil and rain. It was the smell of ordinary life returning. For the first time it felt foreign to him. The simplicity of it hurt, as if the world's indifference were a betrayal. Yet somewhere inside that pain, a strange tenderness began to grow. His thoughts wandered to Alex's crucifix, lost among the ashes. He wondered if someone had retrieved it, or if it had turned entirely to dust. Perhaps it no longer mattered. Perhaps its meaning lived on without form. Faith, he realized, wasn't in the object. It was in endurance. She had proved that. The path descended into a meadow, bright with wild thyme and yellow gorse. The hum of insects filled the air, a quiet orchestra of persistence. Etienne stopped to breathe it in. The first true breath of peace he had taken all day. Nature cared nothing for courts or kings. It answered only to time. The sun, now past its zenith, painted everything in gold and shadow. Dust rose from the path, glowing faintly in the light. Etienne's steps grew slower, not from weariness, but from awe. Even the smallest leaf seemed newly significant. The world was rebuilding itself, moment by moment. He reached a ridge overlooking the valley, where the land stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Villages dotted the distance like forgotten prayers. Somewhere among them, others were living, working, believing. He realized how fragile it all was. The line between faith and fear, truth and control. That was humanity's curse and its beauty. Sitting on a flat stone, he removed the feather from his cloak. It was still there, untouched, black and smooth. He turned it in the sunlight, watching how it shimmered between darkness and silver. It looked like balance itself, fragile, shifting, necessary. He smiled faintly, the first time his face had softened that day. Below, the stream caught the light and scattered it like glass. Birds skimmed its surface, unafraid of reflection. Etienne watched their effortless flight and felt a pang of envy, not for their freedom, but for their simplicity. They knew nothing of guilt or fire. Their faith was in motion, not doctrine. He thought again of Fray Thomas, the weight that must now haunt the man's prayers. Authority left no space for doubt, yet doubt was the first honest act of faith. Perhaps that too was part of redemption, to question, to ache, to change. The fire had purified nothing. It had simply revealed what was already burning inside them all. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. Etienne tilted his head, expecting rain, but only a soft drizzle came. The drops hissed gently on the warm stones, washing away faint traces of ash. The scent of wet pine filled the air, bitter-sweet and clean. The sky wept softly, without witness. The road grew muddy, and his boots left deep prints in the clay. He didn't mind. Each step felt deliberate, grounding him in the living world. Behind him, the rain blurred the outlines of the past. Ahead, it cleared the air. It was as though the earth itself were breathing out the memory of fire. By dusk, Etienne found shelter beneath a small archway of a ruined barn. He built a tiny fire, its light weak but comforting. The warmth brushed his hands gently, and for a moment he thought of her again. Not of her death, but of her quiet strength. That, he knew, would not turn to ash. He took a piece of bread from his satchel, breaking it in half before eating. The gesture reminded him of communion, though he hadn't meant it that way. He smiled at the irony. Faith rediscovered in hunger and solitude. The bread tasted simple, earthy, real. It filled the silence better than any prayer could. Outside, the wind had calmed. The rain stopped. A deep hush spread over the valley, heavy but kind. The air smelled of smoke, soil, and rebirth. Etienne leaned against the wall, his eyes half closed. Peace, he thought, is not granted. It's earned, and sometimes stolen. As night fell, he looked up to the faint glow of stars breaking through the clouds. They seemed distant yet alive, like witnesses to a truth no fire could destroy. Somewhere beyond sight, Alex's story lingered, light traveling farther than the reach of any empire. He whispered a quiet farewell to the sky. When morning came, Etienne would return to the road and the rhythm of his trade. But he would carry her with him, in the scent of pine, in the weight of silence, in the memory of truth that refused to burn. The world would forget her name. He would not. The final moment arrived with an uncanny, profound sense of peace, a natural closing that followed the violence of the system. Alex, bound to the stake, felt the wooden crucifix in her hand grow warm, heated by the fire that slowly intensified around her. What had once been a prelude to pain now became her final, intimate comfort, a tactile link to life and faith itself. The scent of incense thrown onto the flames by the Inquisitor's aides wrapped her in a veil of sweet, penetrating smoke, a forced ritual of purification that ironically filled the air with serenity. The sight of the flames, glowing orange and gold, became her final point of focus, the fire her last and inevitable home. The crackling of the wood was the last living sound she heard, a rhythm quickening and rising, yet to her it resembled the soft wind blowing through her garden, a familiar, melancholic murmur that lulled her into deep stillness. Her mind was calm, free from fear and pain, settled into the quiet peace that comes after suffering's peak. Faint memories returned without words, the roughness of wool in her hands, the smell of damp earth after rain, the warmth of her hearth back in her village, echoes that stood as her final defense against the machinery of the Inquisition and its forced confession. Her final dignity and her serene acceptance of fate formed a gentle reflection between the simplicity of her past and the sacrifice of her present. In her stillness, she understood that her truth, her innocence, could not be burned by fire nor stolen by falsehood. The touch of the crucifix became her poetic farewell, a humble object turned into the symbol of her unshakable faith and her crushed yet undefeated humanity. From within the crowd, the merchant Etienne watched the crucifix in her hand, a symbol of silent defiance seared into his memory, proof that her truth lived in her gesture, not in the words of the sentence. The fire's heat grew stronger, the air around her thick and heavy, yet Alex in her stillness felt only the cold, serene peace enveloping her, her final refuge. The crackle of burning wood and the incense's fading sweetness were her last sounds and scents, and her soul, freed from body and injustice, found its quiet rest. Her death, born of lies coerced through pain, stood as evidence of the system's cruelty, but her final dignity became its counterpoint, the pure, silent message of peace and resistance. The fire's heat, wrapping completely around her, was the last physical sensation Alex felt, an intense warmth that consumed both pain and fear. That final temperature was her liberation, the end of her body and her suffering. The scent of incense rose in thick columns of smoke, mingling with the smell of wood and flesh. But to Alex, the dominant aroma was pine smoke, the fragrance of the forest and the earth, her final perfume, the scent of her departure. She closed her eyes, focusing on the warm, familiar touch of the crucifix in her hand, her last object of devotion and silent resistance. The crackle of the burning wood and the low roar of the flames were her final sounds of life, a rhythm that quickened and grew louder, yet to her it was the sound of her soul rising freely, escaping the injustice and cruelty of men. In the crowd, the merchant Etienne watched the crucifix in Alex's hand, his eyes fixed on that simple object that had become a symbol of crushed innocence. His breathing was deep and slow, a rhythm of reflection and silent mourning for the peasant woman condemned by coerced lies. Alex's reflections on her past and present formed a poetic metaphor of farewell. Her life, like the wool she once spun, had been a simple and honest tapestry, burned and destroyed by the falseness and cruelty of the system. Yet the thread of her truth remained intact, invisible and unbreakable. The touch of the crucifix was her final link to faith and to humanity, a symbol of hope and forgiveness, standing in stark contrast to the flames of condemnation. Her final moment was not a scream of pain or despair, but a deep silence, a stillness that settled within the fire, a cold, serene peace that became her last message of dignity and defiance. Her death, born from lies torn out through coercion, was the ultimate proof of the system's cruelty, yet her final dignity and calm acceptance of fate were her last and undeniable victory over terror. The thick smoke rising from the square drifted upward toward the sky, and the roar of the fire slowly faded, giving way to a heavy, melancholic silence. Etienne, still among the crowd, walked away slowly, carrying with him the weight of conscience and the image of the crucifix in the peasant woman's hand, a symbol of faith and injustice seared into his memory. His journey home would be marked by doubt and by a growing mistrust in the system that had condemned an innocent woman through forced lies. The memory of Alix, the peasant who confessed to what she never did, would linger in the air of that village, a silent and haunting warning against defying power and authority. But for Etienne, her story would remain a tale of quiet resistance and unbroken dignity, the proof that truth, even when crushed, could never be completely destroyed. Until tomorrow, I'll be waiting to travel through these forgotten ages with you. You already know where to find me, right here, between history and dream. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and sleep well, traveler.